sky above, the USS Cushing was a canvas of chaos, painted with the black smudges of flak and the silver streaks of diving aircraft. Men scrambled across the deck, their movements a frantic ballet of survival as Japanese Zeros screamed out of the sun. The air itself seemed to vibrate, a physical force composed of the deafening roar of engines, the sharp crack of 5-inch guns, and the relentless, staccato hammering of smaller anti-aircraft cannons. For the gunners, swiveling their heavy weapons against the blur of enemy planes, it was a desperate and maddening exercise in futility. They were not aiming, not truly. They were praying, hurling thousands of pounds of high explosives into the air and hoping that sheer volume would translate into a single lucky hit. A young sailor, his face smeared with soot and sweat, fed a belt of shells into the chattering breech of a 20mm Oerlikon. His world had narrowed to the circular sight, the fleeting silhouette of a plane, and the violent judder of the weapon in his hands. He tracked a Zero as it banked sharply, leading it just as he had been trained, his fingers squeezing the trigger until the barrel glowed orange. Tracer rounds arced upward, a graceful, fiery line that curved behind the enemy aircraft, close enough to see the rising sun insignia, but never close enough to tear into its fragile frame. The plane released its payload, the bomb whistling down to explode in a geyser of white water, perilously close to the destroyer's hull. The sailor felt the concussion through the deck plates, a tremor of near miss that was becoming terrifyingly familiar. This was the brutal arithmetic of naval anti-aircraft defense in 1942. It required a direct impact to destroy a plane, a task akin to threading a needle during an earthquake. The shells, equipped with simple timed or impact fuses, were useless unless they struck their target directly or exploded at a preset moment that rarely, if ever, coincided with a plane's position. The gunners were fighting a battle of statistics, and the statistics were grimly in the enemy's favor. They watched, helpless, as formations of bombers flew through their flak barrages, emerging momentarily obscured by smoke, only to continue their deadly runs unscathed. Below decks, the situation was no less tense. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and fear. Damage control teams stood by, their hands gripping shoring timbers and fire hoses, waiting for the inevitable hit. Each near miss was a reprieve, each distant explosion a reminder of their vulnerability. The ship's captain stood on the bridge, his jaw clenched, watching the spectacle of his own impotence. His ship, a marvel of modern engineering, was being methodically stalked by a weapon it could not effectively counter. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, looking for reassurance he could not give. Their survival depended not on skill or technology, but on the whims of chance and the limited fuel capacity of the enemy aircraft. As the attack finally subsided, the Zeros climbing away to disappear into the cloud cover, a sickening silence descended, broken only by the crackle of fires and the moans of the wounded. The deck was littered with spent shell casings that glittered in the tropical sun like malignant confetti. Men slumped against their gun mounts, their bodies trembling with spent adrenaline, their faces etched with a profound frustration that bordered on despair. They had fired enough steel to build a small bridge to the enemy, and yet the hangar was smoldering, and their comrades were being carried away on stretchers. They had survived, but they had not prevailed. The problem was stock, a bleeding wound in the Allied war effort. Against the speed of modern aviation, their best defenses were tragically fatally blind. While the scent of cordite still hung heavy over the Pacific, a different kind of battle was being waged in a quiet lecture hall at Johns Hopkins University. Here, the air was thick not with smoke, but with the sharp, electric scent of ozone from humming electrical equipment and the palpable weight of intellectual desperation. Chalk dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight, falling through tall windows, illuminating blackboards, covered in a frantic scroll of equations and circuit diagrams. At the center of this cerebral storm was Merle Tuve, a man whose calm demeanor belied the furious tempo of his thoughts. He paced before his assembled team of physicists and engineers, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on an invisible point of failure thousands of miles away. The reports from the fleet were stark, and Tuve read them not as dry military dispatches, but as obituaries written in advance. The problem was a ghost haunting the room. The sheer impossibility of hitting a small, fast-moving target with a dumb shell. They had exhausted the conventional avenues. Better predictors, faster tracking guns, more powerful explosives. All were mere incremental improvements on a fundamentally flawed system. What was needed was not a better way to aim, but a way to make the shell itself aim. It needed a sense of perception, an ability to know when its target was near, to feel the presence of the enemy and decide for itself the perfect moment to die. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the floor, the conversation turned, as it often did, to the work of their British counterparts. Tuve's mind drifted back across the Atlantic to the clandestine exchanges and shared memos that formed the fragile, vital bridge of Allied scientific cooperation. He remembered the early, almost fantastical concepts emerging from the telecommunications research establishment in England. British researchers, facing the same aerial onslaught during the Battle of Britain, had been playing with a radical notion. They envisioned a tiny, self-contained radio set, small enough to be housed in the nose of an artillery shell. The spark, the crucial leap of logic, had been there in their preliminary notes. A shell could continuously transmit a radio signal. If that signal struck a solid object, like the metal skin of an aircraft, it would reflect back. A miniature receiver inside the shell could listen for its own returning echo. The moment the reflected signal grew strong enough, the moment the shell sensed it was lethally close, a simple circuit would close, and the high explosive would detonate. It was a concept of breathtaking elegance and staggering difficulty, a thinking weapon. Back in the Johns Hopkins lab, the idea took root, fertilized by transatlantic collaboration. One of Tuve's engineers, a man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetual squint, had been sketching idly on a notepad. He drew a simple oscillator, a diode, and an amplifier, connecting them in a loop. He then drew a shell, and around it, a series of concentric circles representing the radio waves pulsing outward. He sketched an aircraft intersecting those waves, and a dashed line bouncing back to the shell. He tapped the point of intersection with his pencil, leaving a dark, definitive dot. That was the moment. That was the kill zone. The room fell silent as others gathered around, looking at the crude drawing. It was no longer just a theoretical discussion from a British lab. It was a blueprint, a ghost of a solution given form. They were no longer just trying to build a better fuse. They were attempting to give a piece of metal a sixth sense, to teach a weapon how to see. The blueprint, once a fantastical sketch, now demanded architects. Merle Tuve's quiet office at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism became the epicenter of a silent, urgent draft, not of soldiers, but of minds. The war's most critical battlefield was shifting from the vast Pacific to the cluttered confines of American laboratories, and the weapon they needed required a new kind of soldier, one who fought with oscilloscopes and soldering irons. Tuve and his inner circle began their quiet crusade, scanning university rosters and industrial research departments for the rare few whose names were whispered in the hushed corridors of physics and electronics. They were not looking for theorists, but for practical magicians, men who could bend the esoteric laws of radio waves to the brutal, simple purpose of destruction. The summons arrived, not as a formal letter, but as a discreet telephone call. or a quiet word in a private office. Alan Breck, a brilliant electronics engineer from MIT, it came as a visit from two serious men in plain suits who appeared at his laboratory door one evening. They spoke in low, compelling tones of a project of the utmost urgency and secrecy, a matter of national survival. They offered no details, only a train ticket to Washington, D.C., and a promise that his unique skills were needed. Alan stood in his lab after they left, his hand resting on a half-assembled amplifier, the familiar scent of rosin and warm vacuum tubes suddenly feeling like a memory. He looked at the photograph on his desk, his wife, Helen, laughing in the garden, their two young sons tumbling at her feet. The weight of the unspoken mission settled on him, a physical pressure. He was being asked to trade the certain tangible world of his research for a shadow war of unknowns, to disappear into a silence from which he might not return. Across the country, similar scenes played out. In a California physics department, a young prodigy named Richard Miles was pulled from a graduate seminar. In a Bell Labs facility in New Jersey, a team specializing in miniaturized components was quietly reassigned, their personnel files stamped with a new, cryptic classification. These men were the best in their fields, plucked from the forefront of a nascent technological revolution. They packed a single suitcase with a few personal effects, offering their families vague explanations about special government work. Their words, hollow with the lie. The farewells were hushed, strained affairs filled with unasked questions and unspoken fears. Wives embraced their husbands, feeling the new tension in their shoulders, while children clung to legs, confused by the sudden serious mood. These were not the dramatic, flag-waving departures of infantrymen. They were quiet, anxious exoduses into the unknown. Their arrival in Washington was a descent into a new reality. They were met not with fanfare, but with security checks and stern-faced military police. They were ushered into a drab, newly constructed building on the outskirts of the city, a place that smelled of fresh paint and concrete dust, its windows shaded and its corridors patrolled. The initial briefing was conducted in a sterile conference room by a Navy captain whose demeanor was as rigid as his starched uniform. He stood before a blank wall, his hands clasped behind his back, and laid out the problem in the same stark terms Tuve had used. But where Tuve had offered a spark of intellectual possibility, the captain offered only cold, hard necessity. He spoke of the casualty reports, the lost ships, the mathematical certainty of failure with current tactics. When Tuve finally unveiled the concept of the Proximity Fuze, the reaction in the room was not one of excitement, but of profound skepticism, particularly from the military observers present. A senior Army artillery colonel, his face a road map of a career spent with big guns and simple mechanics, snorted in disbelief. The idea of a shell that could think, that could sense its target, sounded like something from the pages of a science fiction pulp magazine. He voiced the practical, brutal objections. How could anything so delicate survive the 20,000 G-force of being fired from a naval cannon? How could a radio be powered inside a spinning, vibrating shell? He saw it as a physicist's pipe dream, a dangerous diversion of resources and brilliant minds from the practical work of building more and bigger conventional shells. The tension in the room was palpable. A clash of two worlds, the old school of military pragmatism, colliding with the new, unproven frontier of electronic wizardry. The scientists, for their part, felt the weight of the colonel's skepticism, like a physical blow. They had been recruited for a miracle, and they were already being told it was impossible. The mission, they realized, was not just to build a new weapon, but to first win a war of belief within their own ranks. The transatlantic alliance, forged in desperation, began to materialize in the damp, hidden corners of Britain. While the American team grappled with institutional skepticism, their British counterparts operated in a world shaped by more immediate threats: the ever-present drone of enemy aircraft and the shudder of distant explosions. Their laboratories were not pristine facilities, but repurposed country manors and underground bunkers, places where the scent of old wood and damp stone mingled with the sharp tang of ozone and hot valves. Here, amidst blackout curtains and the constant hum of generators, the theoretical spark from the telecommunications research establishment was being forced into tangible, war-hardened reality. The arrival of the first American technical liaison, a quiet man named Dr. Petrov, was a moment of cautious convergence. He was escorted through a maze of security checkpoints to a laboratory hidden beneath a nondescript farmhouse in the Malvern Hills. The contrast to the spacious American facilities was stark. The British lab was a cramped, low-ceilinged space, its walls lined with rough-hewn timber supports, every surface cluttered with oscilloscopes, breadboards, and half-disassembled radio equipment. The British scientists, led by the gaunt but fiercely intense Dr. Alistair Finch, worked with a grim economy of movement, their faces pale from long hours without sunlight. They greeted Petrov not with ceremony, but with a weary acknowledgement of fellow travelers on the same desperate road. The initial handshakes were firm, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. They were allies, but they were also rivals for the same scarce resources: specialized vacuum tubes, high-grade capacitors, and the precious time needed to avert catastrophe. The collaboration was immediately tested by the brutal arithmetic of scarcity. A single crate of American-made miniature tubes capable of withstanding immense vibration became a treasure over which polite arguments simmered. Finch's team needed them for their ruggedized transmitter designs, while Petrov, under orders from Tuve, was instructed to reserve the bulk for the stateside production effort. The shared workbenches became silent battlegrounds, with British and American engineers sometimes working side by side on parallel problems, their collaboration strained by the knowledge that a breakthrough on one side of the Atlantic might not immediately benefit the other. Meals in the cramped, subterranean canteen were often eaten in a strained silence, the camaraderie of a shared goal frayed by the pressure of limited components and the looming shadow of the Luftwaffe. The turning point came not from a technical triumph, but from a moment of raw human sacrifice. A young British researcher, Arthur Pendleton, was tasked with testing a new, more sensitive receiver circuit. The design was promising but unstable, prone to firing erratically under certain power loads. The safe procedure was to conduct the test with the prototype secured inside a heavily shielded steel box, but that added a delay of hours they did not have, with a new batch of V1 launch sites being identified daily. Pendleton, a man whose gentle demeanor belied a core of steel, made a quiet decision. He dismissed his assistant for a tea break, and with the lab momentarily empty, he bypassed the safety protocols. He worked alone under the harsh glow of a single bare bulb, his hands steady as he connected the fragile circuit to a live power source, holding the unshielded components in his gloved hands to monitor the oscilloscope's flickering green trace. He was measuring the signal-to-noise ratio, his body now the primary shielding against stray radiation. The circuit hummed, the needle on a power meter twitching dangerously high. He knew the risks. A sudden surge could flood the immediate area with a burst of high-frequency energy, a silent, invisible storm that could cook flesh from the inside. For 20 tense minutes, he held his position, his brow beaded with sweat, meticulously recording the data that would confirm the circuit's fatal flaw. He completed the test, powering down the apparatus just as his assistant returned. Only the slight tremor in his hands and a sudden sharp nosebleed betrayed the silent danger he had faced. He had traded his personal safety for a few precious hours, providing the critical data that allowed Finch and Petrov to jointly redesign the faulty component that very night. The incident was never formally recorded, but it echoed through the hidden lab, dissolving the last barriers of reservation. The shared burden and the shared risk had finally forged a true unbreakable team. The alliance was no longer just a matter of policy. It was a bond written in courage and sealed with silent sacrifice. The dream of a thinking shell collided with the brutal physics of reality inside a windowless concrete chamber known as the Shake and Bake. This was where elegance met violence, where the delicate symphony of a radio circuit was subjected to the screaming chaos of a cannon's fury. The scientist's triumph at assembling a working prototype on a lab bench was a mirage. A fragile illusion shattered the moment they tried to imprison their creation inside the cold, unforgiving steel of a 5-inch shell casing. The problem was one of scale, a battle fought in millimeters and milligrams, a war against the very laws of nature they sought to harness. Miniaturization was a torture of precision. Components that sat comfortably on a tabletop had to be shrunk, hardened, and integrated into a space no larger than a pint glass, a space that also had to contain a power source and a lethal charge of high explosive. Vacuum tubes, the fragile hearts of their radio sets, were the primary point of failure. Glass envelopes shattered under the slightest stress. Filaments, finer than a human hair, snapped like overtuned violin strings. Engineers hunched over microscopes, their eyes straining as they used tweezers to position tiny plates and grids, soldering connections with needles so fine the resulting bead of metal was nearly invisible. They built intricate cages of spring wire and rubber mounts, attempting to cradle the tubes in a protective embrace, but the shell's environment was a special kind of hell no cradle could soothe. The testing regimen was a ritual of systematic destruction. A completed fuse, the product of weeks of painstaking labor, would be ceremoniously loaded into a massive hydraulic-driven rig. With a shuddering groan, the machine would come to life, simulating the violent, spinning acceleration of a naval gun, firing a force exceeding 20,000 times the pull of gravity. The scientists would watch through thick portholes, their faces pale as the rig screamed its metallic fury. When it fell silent, they would extract their creation, their hopes rising for a fleeting second before the diagnostics began. More often than not, the delicate web of wires inside would be a tangled bird's nest. Resistors were pulverized into dust. Capacitors were crushed. The tiny vacuum tubes were reduced to a glittering powder of glass and filament at the bottom of the casing. Each test was a funeral for a week's work, a silent, expensive confirmation of their failure. The emotional toll accumulated like the pile of broken prototypes in the corner of the lab. Morale, once buoyed by the sheer audacity of their goal, began to sink under the weight of relentless frustration. The initial excitement curdled into a grinding, soul-deadening routine of build, test, and fail. Men who had been plucked from the pinnacle of their careers now found themselves performing the work of watchmakers, only to see their intricate timepieces smashed by a hammer every Friday afternoon. They worked in shifts around the clock, their lives governed by the brutal schedule of the testing rig, their world reduced to the four walls of the lab and the distant, nagging awareness of a war they were failing to influence. Deadlines imposed by the Navy loomed like storm clouds, their dates immutable, and their consequences dire. A senior officer would visit periodically, his presence a silent accusation. He would stand with his hands behind his back, looking at the latest failure, his face a stony mask that offered no comfort, only a reminder of the ships being sunk and the men being lost while they fumbled with their tiny, broken radios. The pressure fractured the team. Heated arguments erupted over design philosophies, with the American preference for robust, simple circuits clashing with the British drive for more sensitive, complex ones. The collaborative spirit forged in sacrifice began to fray under the unyielding pressure of repeated, humiliating failure. They were running out of time, out of ideas, and out of the belief that had first drawn them into the secret, windowless room. The thinking shell remained a prisoner of its own fragility, a brilliant mind trapped in a body that could not survive its own birth. The graveyard of shattered prototypes grew, a silent monument to the tyranny of physics. Each failed test in the shake-and-bake rig was a fresh burial, interring not just glass and wire, but a little more of the team's collective hope. The problem of the power source had become the central, seemingly insurmountable obstacle. The miniature batteries they had engineered, marvels of compact chemistry on the lab bench, became traitors under stress. The violent acceleration of launch would cause their internal components to short, their electrolytes to leak, or their casings to rupture, rendering the most brilliant radio circuitry as useless as a stone. The fuse was a brain without a heartbeat, a sentinel that fell silent the moment it was called to duty. Despair, a cold and heavy fog, began to seep into the corners of the laboratory, dimming the lights and silencing the usual low hum of focused conversation. It was in this atmosphere of grinding stagnation that Dr. Emil Voss found himself alone late one night, the cavernous lab lit only by the green glow of his oscilloscope and a single desk lamp that pooled light onto a battlefield of schematics and half-disassembled battery carcasses. Voss, a materials chemist whose German accent had once raised eyebrows, but whose genius had silenced them, had not slept properly in weeks. His world had narrowed to the internal architecture of a power cell, to the microscopic dance of ions and electrons that had to continue flawlessly amidst an earthquake. He had tried everything: reinforced casings, gelled electrolytes, shock-absorbent matrices, but the G-forces always found a weakness, a microscopic flaw to exploit. The deadline for a viable prototype was now measured in days, not weeks, and the pressure was a physical weight on his shoulders. The breakthrough did not arrive with a clap of thunder, but with the quiet, almost absurd observation of a mundane object. Exhausted, his vision blurring, Voss reached for his coffee mug to take a sip, only to find it empty. He had absent-mindedly placed it on a stack of papers, next to a disassembled battery. As he lifted the ceramic mug, he noticed the faint, damp ring it had left on a schematic. The paper had wicked the residual moisture, swelling slightly and darkening the lines of the circuit diagram. He stared at the ring, his tired mind making a slow, improbable connection. It was not the coffee, but the action of the porous paper. The way it absorbed and distributed the liquid evenly, holding it in a stable state. His eyes, red-rimmed with fatigue, darted from the coffee stain to the open battery on his bench, to the complex, rigid separators inside that kept the chemical components apart. They were too brittle, too unforgiving. What if the solution wasn't about building a stronger wall, but about creating a more resilient, integrated system? What if the electrolyte, the lifeblood of the battery, was suspended not as a free liquid, but within a solid, porous and flexible medium matrix that could absorb shock and distribute stress like the paper had absorbed the coffee? A jolt of pure, undiluted clarity shot through his weariness. He scrambled for a fresh notepad, his pencil flying across the page. He sketched a new design, not of a battery, but of a power module. He envisioned a cathode and anode separated by a specially treated Microporous cardboard or fabric saturated with a thickened electrolyte gel. The entire assembly would be compressed and sealed within a flexible rubber-like casing that could deform slightly under pressure instead of cracking. He worked through the rest of the night in a feverish haze, cannibalizing parts from failed units, mixing new chemical compounds, and hand-assembling a crude version of his concept. He ignored the clock, the ache in his back, the world outside the pool of light on his bench. This was no longer about duty or deadlines. It was about the pure, stubborn pursuit of an idea, a final, desperate act of perseverance against impossible odds. As the first gray light of dawn touched the blacked-out windows, he held the finished prototype in his palm. It was ungainly, wrapped in a temporary seal of wax and tape, but it was his. He carried it to the testing rig with the reverence of a priest bearing a sacrament, his heart hammering against his ribs. He loaded it, not into a full shell, but into a smaller, brutal centrifuge, designed to simulate the spin. He flipped the switch. The machine whirred to life, its sound a familiar scream of judgment. When it stopped, he extracted the module with trembling hands. He connected it to a meter. The needle swung decisively to the right, holding steady. The battery had survived. It had not just survived. It was producing a clean, stable voltage. In the quiet of the empty lab, surrounded by the ghosts of 100 failures, Emil Voss allowed himself a single, slow smile. The heart of the thinking shell was now beating. The laboratory hummed with a new electric tension, a current of focused anticipation that had replaced the grim fog of despair. Emil Voss's breakthrough with the ruggedized battery module was the spark that had reignited the entire project, transforming the atmosphere from one of funereal resignation to one of breathless, urgent hope. The power source, once the project's Achilles heel, was now its sturdy, beating heart. The team moved with a renewed purpose, their movements precise and synchronized, as they began the final, delicate assembly of the first, fully integrated Proximity Fuze. This was no longer an experiment. It was an act of creation, the birth of a new kind of weapon. The assembly took place in a sealed, climate-controlled clean room, a sanctuary of order, amidst the usual clutter of the lab. The air was still and filtered, free of the dust that could settle on a critical connection and spell failure. Under the brilliant, unforgiving light of surgical lamps, the scientists worked with the quiet concentration of master watchmakers. They wore white lint-free coats and cotton gloves, their faces masked, their every breath a potential contaminant. The shell casing, a 5-inch hollow cylinder of cold machined steel, lay open on a bed of soft foam like a patient on an operating table. One by one, the components were installed with painstaking care. First, the power module, Voss's creation, now elegantly encased in a resilient, rubberized shell, was nestled into the base. Then came the miniature vacuum tubes, each one now cradled in a revolutionary new suspension system of fine, coiled springs and shock-absorbent silicone pads, a design born from the ashes of countless shattered predecessors. Next, the tiny, hand-wound copper coils of the oscillator and the meticulously soldered circuit board, a labyrinth of silver traces on a substrate of phenolic resin, were carefully lowered into place. Wires, insulated with a new flexible coating, were connected with micro-soldering irons, the tiny beads of molten metal gleaming under the lights. The air was thick with the scent of hot rosin and ozone, the holy incense of this high-stakes ritual. No one spoke. The only sounds were the faint hiss of the ventilation, the click of tools on metal, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the assemblers. Each successful connection, each component that clicked securely into its designated space, felt like a minor victory, a step closer to the impossible. When the last wire was connected, and the final diagnostic check confirmed a clean circuit. A collective, held breath was released. The nose cone, containing the high explosive charge and the final detonator, was threaded onto the body of the fuse with a series of precise, quarter-turn clicks. The sound was definitive, a lock turning. The assembly was complete. In the hands of its creators, it no longer looked like a collection of parts. It was a single, sinister entity, a sleek cylinder of dull gray steel that contained a dormant intelligence. It was heavy, dense, with potential, and cold to the touch. They placed it gently into a padded carrying case, and the procession to the testing range began. A silent, somber march toward a moment of truth. Years in the making. The test range was a vast, desolate expanse of scrubland cordoned off for miles in every direction. A single, obsolete cargo plane drone, its fuselage pockmarked from previous tests, was towed to a starting point downrange. The fuse was loaded into a special artillery piece, its barrel aimed not to hit the drone, but to pass within a calculated lethal distance of it. The scientists and a handful of top brass observers took their positions in a reinforced concrete bunker half a mile away, their faces pressed against thick glass viewports. The tension was a physical presence, coiling in the pit of every stomach. Mel Tuve stood at the front, his knuckles white as he gripped a pair of binoculars. This was the culmination of every failure, every sleepless night, every sacrificed personal life. A red flare arced into the sky, signaling the start. The drone's engine coughed to life, and the plane began its slow, lumbering taxi down the runway. A moment later, the artillery piece roared, a flat, concussive thump that hit the bunker's glass like a physical blow. The shell was away, a barely visible speck racing skyward, trailing a thin wake of smoke. All eyes, aided by binoculars and powerful scopes, tracked its trajectory as it curved, intersected the path of the drone, and then passed it. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed like yet another failure. A silent, dumb projectile soaring harmlessly by its target. But then, precisely at the calculated moment of closest approach, a flash of light bloomed in the empty air between the shell and the drone. It was not a large explosion, but it was perfectly, brilliantly placed. A split second later, the shockwave reached the bunker, a dull whump that vibrated through the concrete floor. The drone flew directly through the cloud of shrapnel. Its wings sheared off, tearing away in a grotesque slow-motion ballet of rending metal. The fuselage cartwheeled once, then slammed into the earth, erupting into a satisfying secondary fireball. Inside the bunker, the silence was absolute for a full 3 seconds, broken only by the distant crump of the impact. Then, a single sharp intake of breath broke the spell. It was followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated awe. Men turned to each other, their faces etched not with cheers, but with a profound, almost religious wonder. They had done it. They had given a piece of metal the power to see, to decide, to kill with a terrifying new efficiency. The hope that filled the bunker was no longer a fragile thing. It was as solid and real as the twisted wreckage smoldering on the horizon. They had not just built a new weapon. They had changed the nature of war itself. The success that bloomed in the desert test range was a flower that had to be kept in a vault. The awe that filled the bunker was immediately followed by a cold, clamping dread. They had not just created a weapon, they had created a secret so potent that its mere existence could shift the balance of the war. If the Axis powers learned of the Proximity Fuze, if they grasped the principle and replicated it, the entire advantage would be nullified, and the skies would once again belong to the enemy. The laboratory, once a haven of open collaboration, was swiftly transformed into a fortress of paranoia. The transition was jarring. Where once scientists had debated theories across cluttered benches, they now spoke in hushed tones, their words measured and their eyes occasionally darting toward the newly installed security personnel, who stood like silent sentinels at every door. Code names descended upon the project like a fog, obscuring its true nature behind a bland and bureaucratic lexicon. The fuse itself was no longer a fuse. It became Device A, or in more formal correspondence, the VT, for Variable Time Fuse. Their work was no longer research. It was Section T activities. Laboratories were not labs. They were facilities. The very language they used was stripped of meaning, a defensive measure against the ever-present threat of unseen listeners. Access became a matter of tiered privilege. Colored badges were issued, a spectrum of clearance that dictated which doors would open and which secrets would be revealed. The innermost sanctum, where the final assembly and most sensitive diagnostics took place, required a crimson badge. Merle Tuve and his inner circle moved through the facility like ghosts, their crimson passes granting them access to a world that was increasingly walled off from the very people helping to build it. This new culture of secrecy bred a low-grade, persistent paranoia that seeped into the daily routine. The genial, open exchanges between American and British teams became more guarded, filtered through the lens of operational security. A casual question about a colleague's family could be misconstrued as a probing inquiry into their background and loyalties. The trash was no longer simply discarded. It was incinerated under armed guard, the ashes sifted for any fragment of a schematic or a misplaced note. The sound of a telephone ringing, once mundane, now caused a subtle tension in a room, a collective pause, as everyone waited to see if the call would be for them, and what new restriction it might herald. They were building a weapon to defend freedom by walling themselves inside a prison of their own making, and the irony was a bitter taste on the tongue. The system, for all its rigid protocols, was vulnerable to the simple, human moment of error. It happened to Dr. Day, Alan Breck, the MIT engineer who had left his family for the shadows of the project. Exhausted after a 36-hour shift troubleshooting a persistent fluctuation in the oscillator circuit, he stumbled into the designated canteen for a much-needed coffee. His mind was still whirring with frequencies and capacitances, a world of abstract problems. He found himself sitting across from a fellow scientist from a different, less classified wing of the facility, a man he knew casually from pre-war conferences. The man, seeing Breck's haggard appearance, made a light-hearted comment about the secret squirrel work, keeping him up all night. In his fatigued state, desperate for a moment of normal human connection, Breck let his guard down. He didn't reveal specifics, but he murmured something about the damnable sensitivity of the echo-sensing apparatus, a phrase that was, in their world, as revealing as a detailed blueprint. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it was witnessed by a security officer posing as a custodian mopping the floor with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. Within the hour, Breck was summoned from his bench by two stern-faced men in civilian clothes. The walk to the debriefing room felt like a march to the gallows. The room was small, windowless, and lit by a single harsh bulb. The two men sat across from him, their expressions neutral, but their eyes missing nothing. They did not shout or threaten. Instead, they employed a cold, methodical pressure, dissecting his every word from the canteen, forcing him to repeat the exchange verbatim, their silence more terrifying than any accusation. They made him understand, in excruciating detail, the potential consequences of his careless phrase. That a janitor in a Berlin subway, a waiter in a Tokyo cafe, could be an agent. That a single, whispered term could find its way into an enemy intelligence report and connect the dots. They stripped the incident of any context of fatigue or human frailty, reducing it to a simple, unforgivable breach. Breck emerged from the room an hour later, pale and visibly shaken. The incident was not recorded in his official file. His value to the project was too great, but the lesson was branded onto his soul. The following day, a new directive was circulated, reinforced in a mandatory all-hands briefing. It outlined stricter compartmentalization. Scientists would now only be given the information absolutely essential to their specific task. Talk of work outside of secure areas was grounds for immediate dismissal and possible prosecution. The invisible walls within the facility grew thicker, the air heavier with suspicion. The brief, human moment of weakness had served its purpose. It had reminded them all that they were not just engineers and physicists. They were soldiers on the most secret front of the war, and the price of a single lapse was a burden too terrible to contemplate. The success sealed within the laboratory was a weapon in theory, but a weapon in a vault was no weapon at all. It had to cross an ocean, to be delivered into the hands of the men on the ships being torn apart by dive bombers and torpedo planes. The most brilliant innovation in modern warfare was useless if it could not reach the front, and the path to the front was 1,000 miles of gray, pitiless ocean ruled by the silent, predatory shadows of U-boats. The transition from scientific triumph to logistical nightmare was abrupt and sobering. The project's focus shifted from oscilloscopes and circuit boards to convoy schedules and naval charts, from the sterile air of the clean room to the salt-stained map rooms of the Norfolk Navy Yard. Lieutenant Commander James Strickland stood before such a chart now, his fingertips resting on the vast empty expanse of the North Atlantic. The map was a tapestry of dread, crisscrossed with known U-boat patrol lines and marked with the last known positions of merchant ships that had simply vanished, their names now etched on memorials. Strickland was a man carved from oak and sea salt, his face weathered by years of North Atlantic gales. But the weight on his shoulders now was of a different kind. He had been plucked from command of a destroyer escort, a hunter of submarines, and given a new, infinitely more delicate prey. A few dozen crates of delicate electronic components that represented the Allies' best hope. His mission was not to sink the enemy, but to smuggle this fragile hope past them. The planning session took place in a secure briefing room, its windows blacked out, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Strickland stood flanked by a Navy captain and a grim-faced Army colonel, while across the polished mahogany table sat Merle Tuve and Dr. Tubble Sate. Finch, the British lead, the scientists, men of equations and certainty, looked out of place in this world of calculated risk and probable loss. Tuve had brought a single Proximity Fuze, disassembled and laid out in a velvet-lined case. He spoke not of its revolutionary circuitry, but of its vulnerabilities. He explained how the miniature tubes were susceptible to humidity, how the batteries had a finite shelf life, how the delicate soldered joints could be fractured by a single heavy impact. Each word was a reminder that they were not shipping artillery shells, but something closer to laboratory-grown orchids, beautiful, potent, and terrifyingly fragile. Strickland absorbed the information, his eyes never leaving the map. He began to outline his plan, his voice a low, steady rumble. The fuse would not be shipped as a single high-value target. That was an invitation for disaster. Instead, Their components would be broken down, the most sensitive parts. The vacuum tubes and Voss's power modules packed in separate, anonymous crates marked as mundane supplies. Medical equipment, radio parts, even office machinery. These crates would be distributed across multiple ships in a fast convoy, the precious seeds scattered amongst a forest of steel. The convoy itself would take the northern route, braving the frigid, storm-racked waters where U-boat packs were thickest, because the very brutality of the passage offered a perverse kind of cover. No one would expect such valuable cargo on such a dangerous path. The risks were enumerated with brutal clarity by the Navy captain. He pointed to a cluster of red pins on the chart west of Iceland, the Black Pit, an area beyond the range of air cover where the U-boats hunted with impunity. He spoke of wolf-pack tactics, of multiple submarines, converging on a single convoy, of the terrible efficiency of the German torpedoes. The loss of even one ship carrying a critical crate could set the entire European deployment back by months. Months they did not have. The V-1 launch sites were multiplying daily, and the casualty reports from the Pacific were a constant, grim drumbeat in the background. The urgency was a physical force in the room, pressing in on them from all sides. This was not a routine supply run. It was a race against an unseen clock, a desperate gamble, where the stakes were not just the cargo, but the very course of the war. Strickland's final words hung in the smoky air, a simple, stark summation of their impossible task. They had to make a ghost train run across the most heavily patrolled battlefield on Earth, and its precious, fragile cargo could not even fight back. The gray dawn found convoy SC-752, a scattered constellation of shadows on a heaving leaden sea. The Liberty ships, their hulls streaked with rust and salt, rose and fell in a slow, ponderous rhythm, their screws churning the water into phosphorescent foam. Aboard the SS Star of Montana, tucked deep in the belly of the ship, amidst crates of spare engine parts and medical supplies, sat 3 unmarked wooden boxes. To any cursory inspection, they contained replacement gyroscopes for a navigation system. In reality, they held the delicate beating hearts of the Proximity Fuze, Emil Voss's power modules, each one a carefully calibrated miracle of chemistry and resilience. Their journey from the sterile lab to this damp, vibrating hold was a leap of faith, a bet placed against the brutal physics of the deep and the cunning of the enemy. For 2 days, the convoy pushed eastward, a slow-moving herd trailed by the vigilant corvettes and destroyer escorts. The mood aboard the merchant ships was a taut wire of tension, strung between the monotony of the voyage and the ever-present threat of sudden, violent death. Lookouts scanned the bold horizon with a desperate intensity, their eyes raw from salt spray and the strain of searching for the telltale feather of a periscope wake. Then, on the 3rd day, as they entered the air gap west of Iceland, the dreaded Black Pit, the contact came. It was not a sighting, but a sound, the sharp, frantic pinging of Estic from the lead escort, a sound that froze the blood of every seasoned sailor. The pinging intensified, a sonar chorus of alarm, and then the water on the starboard side of the convoy erupted. A geyser of white water and black smoke climbed skyward as a tanker, its back broken by a single torpedo, began to settle into the cold embrace of the Atlantic. Chaos descended upon the convoy. Signal lamps flickered urgent, unheeded commands. The ships scattered, their prescribed formations dissolving into a desperate scramble for survival. Aboard the Star of Montana, the order to execute evasive maneuvers sent a violent shudder through the old ship. The engine room telegraph clanged, and the vessel heeled over sharply, its timbers groaning in protest. Down in the hold, the 3 unmarked boxes shifted, their wooden frames screeching against the steel deck. A young ensign, assigned as the secret cargo's guardian, braced himself against a bulkhead, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear the distant, thunderous roar of the escort ship's depth charges, a series of deep, concussive thumps that vibrated through the hull like the blows of a giant's fist. Each explosion was a prayer, a hope that the hunters had become the hunted. But the pinging continued, a relentless metallic heartbeat from the deep, sometimes fading, sometimes growing, terrifyingly close. For hours, the deadly game of cat and mouse continued. The Star of Montana, its engine pushed to its limit, weaved through the churning sea, a lumbering beast trying to outrun a pack of wolves. The ensign, his duty overriding his fear, used a crowbar to hastily reinforce the bracing around the prey's precious crates. His hands slipping on the sweat-slicked metal, he thought of the contents not as weapons, but as fragile, living things, their intricate internals being subjected to stresses no laboratory test could fully replicate. A near miss from a depth charge slammed the ship sideways, and one of the crates broke free, sliding across the deck and crushing into a stanchion with a sickening crack of splintering wood. The ensign's stomach plummeted. He scrambled over, his flashlight beam revealing the dented corner of the crate, a visible wound on its anonymous exterior. There was no time to open it, no way to know if the modules inside were now just so much scrap. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the assault ceased. The pinging faded, the depth charges fell silent, and the only sound was the relentless wind and the pounding of the ship's engine. The corvettes, having driven off or destroyed the U-boat, began the slow, grim process of rounding up the scattered convoy. The Star of Montana limped back into formation, its crew moving in a daze of spent adrenaline. When they finally slipped under the protective umbrella of land-based air cover days, later, a palpable wave of relief washed over the entire convoy. They had made it through the gauntlet. Days later, in a heavily guarded warehouse in Liverpool, the crates were finally opened under the anxious gaze of Dr. Skays, of Dr. Alistair Finch and a team of British technicians. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and nervous anticipation. The crate that had taken the impact was opened first. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam and suspended by shock-absorbent cords, the power modules sat undamaged, their resilient casings having absorbed the blow that had splintered their wooden prison. A technician connected one to a tester. The needles swung to the correct voltage and held, steady and strong. A silent, profound relief passed through the room. The gamble had paid off. The fragile intelligence had been smuggled across the world's most dangerous battlefield, its arrival a quiet, unheralded victory that would soon echo in the skies over London and the waters of the Pacific. The global stakes of their secret war had never been clearer. It was a war fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with ingenuity, courage, and the silent, safe passage of a few unmarked boxes. The drone, a skeletal frame of wood and wire with a sputtering engine, traced a lazy figure eight against the canvas of the sky, a perfect, predictable target for an imperfect world. Below, in the concrete observation bunker, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, cold coffee, and a tension so sharp it could have been cut with a knife. This was no longer the realm of theoretical breakthroughs or fragile first prototypes. This was the grinding, repetitive work of refinement, of chasing the ghost of consistency. For the 10th time that morning, the artillery piece barked its flat, concussive report. The shell, a sleek gray dart, raced skyward, its trajectory a calculated arc of interception. The scientists, their faces pressed against the thick glass, tracked its flight, their collective breath held. The shell did not aim for the drone. It aimed for a point in the empty air beside it, a mathematical abstraction given lethal purpose. As it reached that invisible calculated point, the air itself seemed to flinch. A silent, bright flash blossomed, a miniature sun that lived and died in a fraction of a second, followed a moment later by the dull, satisfying crump of the detonation. The drone, flying directly through the cloud of shrapnel, shuddered violently. A large section of its tail assembly tore away, spinning lazily down towards the earth as the main body of the aircraft wobbled and began its own terminal descent. A low murmur, the first sound in minutes, rippled through the bunker. It was not a cheer, but a release of pent-up anxiety. The sound of a hypothesis being proven, again and again. The data analysts, hunched over their oscillographs and timing instruments, nodded in quiet unison. The 10th detonation had been as precise as the first, the 9th, the 8th. The fuses, once temperamental and fragile, were now performing with a Machin-like reliability that bordered on the eerie. They were no longer just working. They were consistently, predictably, lethally accurate. The thinking shell had learned its lesson, and it was a prodigy. Back in the main laboratory, the mood was one of cautious, weary celebration. A junior technician had produced a bottle of cheap whiskey from a locked drawer, and small, paper cups were being filled. The clinking of cups was a soft, hollow sound against the hum of the ventilation system. Men who had spent years staring at oscilloscope screens and piles of shattered components allowed themselves to smile, the lines of stress around their eyes softening for the first time in memory. They shook hands, clapped each other on the back, their conversations a low, relieved buzz. They had scaled the mountain. They had taken a concept from the pages of science fiction and hammered it into a brutal, reliable reality. The weight of countless failures, the sleepless nights, the personal sacrifices, it all seemed, for a fleeting moment, worth it. The moment of celebration was as fragile as their earliest vacuum tubes. The door to the lab swung open, and 3 men in immaculate military uniforms entered. They moved with an authority that silenced the room as effectively as a gunshot. The lead officer, our Army Major General with a chest full of ribbons and a gaze that could etch steel, did not acknowledge the raised paper cups or the relieved faces. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the banks of test equipment, the neat rows of assembled fuses, and the scientists themselves, before coming to rest on WWII. "The data from the range is impressive, Doctor," the general said, his voice devoid of congratulation. It was a statement of fact, cold and hard. The consistency is exactly what we need. Now, we need them by the thousands. Not next year. Not next month. Now. He laid a hand on one of the assembled fuses, his fingers tapping impatiently on the cold steel. This is a laboratory toy. I need a combat weapon. I need something that can be loaded by a 19-year-old sailor in a pitching sea, stored in a tropical hold, fired from a gun barrel that's too hot to touch, and still work every single time. I need it to be manufactured on an assembly line, not assembled by watchmakers. The celebration was over, extinguished as suddenly as a candle in a gale. The gentle hum of the lab was now drowned out by the silent, screaming pressure of a new, even more impossible deadline. The scientists exchanged glances. the brief euphoria in their eyes replaced by a familiar dread. They had conquered the realm of precision, but now they were being ordered to conquer the realm of mass production and brutal endurance. The general and his aides turned and left, their departure as abrupt as their arrival, leaving behind a void filled only with the echo of his demands. The mountain they had just climbed had revealed itself to be merely the first foothill of a far greater, more daunting range. The limits of the team were not just being tested, they were being redefined. The pristine, controlled environment of the laboratory was a distant memory, a sanctuary of order, left behind for the raw, unforgiving chaos of the real world. The transition to the field testing grounds in a remote Utah desert was a brutal awakening. Here, there were no climate-controlled, clean rooms, no vibration-dampened tables, only the vast, indifferent sky, the gritty wind that scoured the sand, and the harsh, unyielding truth of practical application. The first batch of mass-production prototype fuses, which had performed with machinelle-like perfection in the lab, now had to prove their worth not against predictable drone paths, but against the capricious variables of wind, temperature, and the violent reality of being fired from an actual naval gun mounted on a concrete emplacement. The target was a towed sleeve, a long fabric banner hauled by a speedy aircraft, simulating the profile and movement of an enemy plane. It was a crude approximation, but it introduced the elements of real speed and unpredictable turbulence. The first test was conducted under a sky bleached pale by the high desert sun. The gun crew, Navy men brought in for their expertise, handled the 5-inch cannon with a practiced, brutal efficiency that was alien to the scientists watching from a distant bunker. The order to fire was given. The cannon roared, its concussive blast kicking up a cloud of dust and rattling the observation bunker's windows. The shell was a blur against the blue, tracking towards the tiny, weaving speck of the target's sleeve. The scientists leaned forward, their bodies tense with expectation, waiting for the telltale flash that would signal a successful detonation. The shell soared past the sleeve, a silent, dumb projectile that continued on its arc until it detonated harmlessly against the distant mountainside in a puff of smoke. A dud, a wave of cold disappointment, washed through the bunker. It was written off as an anomaly, a single faulty unit. The second test yielded the same result, and the third, with each silent, passing shell. The mood in the bunker curdled from concern into annoying dread. The fourth shell detonated, but it was a premature burst, exploding hundreds of yards short of the target in a useless blossom of fire and smoke. The data was worse than failure. It was erratic, unpredictable behavior. The fuses were not just failing. They were failing in new and inexplicable ways. The pristine data curves from the lab were now a jagged, nonsensical scrawl on the telemetry readouts. The desert air, once a symbol of boundless possibility, now felt like a suffocating blanket of failure. Back in the temporary field lab, a sweltering Quonset hut, filled with the smell of hot electronics, dust, and sweat, the team descended into a frantic, pressure-cooked race against time. The crates of fuzzes were open, their innards exposed on makeshift workbenches. The delicate harmony they had achieved was shattered. The disputes began almost immediately, fracturing the hard-won unity of the team. The American engineers, led by a pragmatic, blunt-spoken man from Ohio, pointed to the power modules. They argued that the desert heat was causing thermal expansion, creating microscopic shorts in Voss's carefully designed matrix. They demanded a return to a more robust, less sensitive design, even if it meant sacrificing some of the fuse's range. The British contingent, championed by Dr. Finch, vehemently disagreed. Their diagnostics pointed to the oscillator circuits, convinced that the specific humidity and particulate matter in the desert air were affecting the radio wave propagation, causing the receiver to misinterpret its own echo. They argued for recalibrating the sensitivity, a complex and time-consuming process. The arguments were not academic. They were visceral, born from exhaustion and the terrifying proximity of total collapse. A junior British technician, sleep-deprived and frayed, snapped at his American counterpart, accusing him of trying to dumb down their creation into mediocrity. The American engineer shot back, his voice rising over the hum of test equipment, that a mediocre weapon that worked was better than a brilliant one that failed when it mattered. The pressure was a physical force in the hut, squeezing the air from the room. Maltuve moved between the factions, a weary peacemaker, his calm demeanor a dam against the rising tide of panic. But the cracks were showing. The thinking shell had been rendered mindless by the real world, and its creators were now turning on each other in a desperate, bitter race to find the ghost in the machine, before the entire project was scrapped, and with it, their years of sacrifice and the hope of countless men at sea. The desert had humbled them, stripping away the veneer of laboratory certainty and exposing the raw, untamed variables of the real world. The Quonset hut was a pressure cooker of frayed nerves and simmering desperation, the air thick with the acrid scent of failure and the bitter aftertaste of fractured collaboration. The arguments over the root cause of the failures, the power module versus the oscillator, had reached a fever pitch, creating a schism that threatened to paralyze the entire effort. It was in this atmosphere of near despair that a junior technician too low in rank to be invested in either faction's dogma made a simple, almost offhand observation. While running a diagnostic on a fuse that had detonated prematurely, he noticed a faint, almost invisible film of fine alkaline dust coating the interior of the casing, a gritty residue that had seeped past the seals during the violent acceleration of firing. This observation, whispered across a workbench, was the thread that began to unravel the entire knot of failure. It was not one single grand flaw, but a cascade of tiny interacting ones. The desert dust, a fine, conductive powder, was compromising electrical insulation. The drastic temperature swings between the cold desert night and the blistering day were causing microscopic expansions and contractions in the soldered joints, creating hairline fractures. The unique atmospheric conditions were indeed affecting the radio waves, but not in the way the British team had theorized. It was a combination of low humidity and particulate matter that was subtly altering the signal's return. The fuse was not failing because of a single design error, but because it was an ecosystem of delicate systems, and the desert was poisoning that ecosystem. A fragile, exhausted truce was called. The teams merged their expertise, attacking the problem, not as rival theorists, but as physicians diagnosing a complex illness. They worked through the night, the hut illuminated by the stark, white light of trouble lamps, the world outside reduced to a black void. They developed new, hermetic sealing techniques using a pliable, synthetic rubber compound. They reinforced the most vulnerable solder joints with a shock-absorbent epoxy. They recalibrated the oscillator sensitivity to account for the dry, dusty air, a painstaking process of minute adjustments, monitored by a bank of oscilloscopes whose green traces flickered like captured ghosts. They were no longer building a laboratory ideal. They were hardening a weapon for the brutal real world. As the sun rose, casting long, sharp shadows across the desert floor, a new batch of modified fuse sat on the workbench, their exteriors identical but their innards subtly, crucially transformed. The return to the test range felt like a funeral march. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. The air, so clear it felt like glass. The target's sleeve was already in the air. A distant white dash against the vastness. There were no speeches, no hopeful glances. The scientists in the bunker were hollowed out by fatigue and the memory of repeated failure. Their postures slumped, their faces grim. The order to fire was given. The sound of the cannon, a familiar, jarring shock. All eyes, aided by binoculars, tracked the shell as it became a speck, racing to intercept the weaving sleeve. The moment of closest approach arrived. And then, it happened. A perfect, silent flash of light blossomed in the empty air, precisely 20 yards from the fabric target. It was not a large explosion, but it was surgically precise. A bloom of orange and black that appeared exactly where the complex mathematics had predicted it should. A split second later, the sound reached the bunker, a sharp, satisfying crump that was the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. The target sleeve flew through the cloud of shrapnel and emerged tattered, large sections of it simply disintegrating. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the bunker, a collective paralysis of disbelief. Then, a second cannon fired. Another shell. Another flawless mid-air detonation. Another shredded sleeve. A third. A fourth. Each one a perfect, lethal blossom in the sky. The transformation in the bunker was slow, then overwhelming. The military observers, men who had maintained a stony skepticism through years of promises, slowly lowered their binoculars. Their faces, usually etched with the hard lines of command, showed something entirely new, pure, unadulterated awe. They were not watching a weapon being fired. They were watching a weapon think. They were witnessing the impossible, a piece of metal making a decision, sensing its target, and choosing the perfect moment of its own destruction. One of the generals, a man who had once derided the project as a fantasy, turned to Merle Tuve, his mouth slightly agape. He didn't speak. He simply shook his head, a gesture of profound, wordless wonder. The skepticism that had been the project's constant companion for years evaporated in those few seconds, replaced by a solid, awe-filled belief. The scientists, for their part, did not cheer. They stood in silence, tears tracing clean lines through the dust on their cheeks. They had not just fixed a technical problem. They had delivered on a promise that had once seemed like madness. They had given sight to the blind, and in the flawless, thinking explosions painting the desert sky, they saw the future of warfare. And it was terrifying, and it was theirs. The stark, awe-filled silence of the desert test range was a world away from the hushed, wood-paneled opulence of the Pentagon briefing room. Here, the air was not charged with the excitement of a scientific triumph, but with the grave, cold weight of absolute power. The flawless performance of the Proximity Fuze was no longer a matter of data points and oscilloscope traces. It was a chess piece on a global board, and the men in this room were the players who would decide where to move it. The decision, when it came, was not announced with fanfare, but delivered in the clipped, unemotional tones of a supreme commander. The Proximity Fuze would be released from its laboratory womb and sent to war. Its first battlefield would be the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, where the kamikaze threat was evolving into a form of warfare so fanatical that it demanded a response beyond mere courage. It would be deployed aboard a select group of ships, its existence guarded by a secrecy so profound that even the sailors who used it would not know what they held in their hands. The news, relayed back to the laboratory by a secure telephone line, landed not as a victory, but as a seismic shock with two distinct, opposing aftershocks. For the military commanders overseeing the project, it was the moment they had sacrificed years to achieve. It was the translation of theory into force, of potential into power. Briefings were convened, where maps of the Pacific were unfurled, and admirals pointed with grim satisfaction to the fleet units that would receive the first shipments. Their language was one of tactics and advantage, of altering Q ratios and protecting assets. They spoke of the fuse not as a creation, but as a tool, a means to an end that was as simple as it was brutal: the destruction of the enemy. New, even more stringent secrecy protocols were drafted and disseminated. The fuse's very existence was to be a state secret of the highest order. Any sailor or officer who discussed its capabilities, or even hinted at its nature, would face court-martial. The weapon that saw would itself remain invisible. For the scientists, however, the deployment orders landed with a different, more complex resonance. A palpable unease filtered through the laboratories and workshops where the fuse were being crated for shipment. These men had lived with the fuse for years, nurturing it from a sketch on a notepad to a functioning entity. They knew its every quirk, its elegant circuitry, the thousands of hours of toil embedded in its cold steel shell. They had fought for it, sacrificed for it, and celebrated its success. But now, faced with the reality of its purpose, a subtle, philosophical disquiet took root. Dr. Alan Breck, holding a freshly assembled unit in his gloved hand, did not see a tactical advantage. He saw the intricate weave of wires, the tiny glowing vacuum tubes, a work of art and intellect that was about to become an instrument of mass death. He thought of the young Japanese pilots, faceless enemies in reports, but now imagined as men in cockpits who would be torn apart by the invisible, thinking explosion his creation would trigger. The ethical weight, once an abstract concept, was now a physical burden. This quiet crisis of conscience manifested not in protest, but in a somber, almost funereal atmosphere that descended over the final assembly lines. The work continued, because the war continued, and the specter of their comrades dying without this advantage was a more immediate moral imperative than any abstract dilemma. But the conversations were hushed, the celebrations entirely absent. They were no longer building a marvel of engineering. They were manufacturing fate. The tension was a thin wire strung between the grim necessity of the commanders and the quiet misgivings of the creators. The laboratory, once a sanctuary of pure science, had become an antechamber to the battlefield. The thinking shell was no longer theirs. It belonged to the war, and its first real test would not be against a toad sleeve in the desert, but against men and machines in the fiery crucible of the Pacific, a test whose results would be measured not in data, but in lives saved and lives extinguished. The stage was set, not for experiment, but for a verdict. The sea was a deceptive mirror, its placid mirror, sun-dappled surface belying the lethal secret being loaded into its depths. The USS Helena, a sleek light cruiser already scarred by previous encounters, lay at anchor in a secluded Pacific lagoon, a temporary sanctuary of still water and whispering palms. But the tranquility was an illusion, broken by the steady, purposeful rhythm of the winches and the low grunts of sailors maneuvering heavy, unmarked crates from a supply ship alongside. These were not the usual munitions. Their stencils shouting their purpose to the world. These crates were anonymous, their plain wood surfaces devoid of any marking save for a single stenciled code VT and a string of numbers that meant nothing to the men handling them. They were ghosts, arriving under the cloak of routine resupply, their true nature known only to a select few aboard the ship. The suspense began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a low current of curiosity that rippled through the crew. They were veterans of the slot. Men who knew the weight of a 5-inch shell and the specific clatter of a ready-service ammunition hoist. This was different. The ordnance officers, usually boisterous and familiar, moved with a new, guarded intensity. The crates were handled with an almost reverential care that felt alien amidst the usual brutal efficiency of naval logistics. They were taken not to the standard magazines, but to a specially prepared, climate-controlled storeroom near the forward turrets, a space that had been stripped and secured under the direct supervision of the ship's executive officer himself. A Marine guard was posted outside its door, his face an unreadable mask, his orders clear and absolute. No one entered without specific, written authorization. The crew, a community bound by shared danger and the relentless gossip of shipboard life, had no facts, only a growing collection of anomalies. They saw the new, specialized tools issued to the gun captains, strange wrenches and diagnostic meters they had never seen before. They noticed the arrival of 2 quiet, civilian-clad technicians who kept to themselves and spoke to no one but the captain and the gunnery officer. The ship was being prepared for something, but for what? No one would say. The official briefing, when it came, was a masterpiece of deliberate obscurity, designed not to inform, but to mystify. The crew was assembled by division. The gunners and loaders gathered in a sweltering compartment below decks. The gunnery officer, a lieutenant commander, named Miller, stood before them, his uniform crisp, despite the oppressive heat. He did not smile. He held up one of the new shells. It looked identical to the old ones, the same shape, the same weight, the same cold gray steel. But it was not the same, and every man in the room could feel it. "Listen up," Miller began, his voice cutting through the low murmur. "What you are looking at is a new type of ammunition. You will refer to it only as VT ammunition. You will not discuss it with anyone outside this room, not even with shipmates from other divisions. Is that understood?" A grunt of assent rippled through the sailors. "The loading and handling procedures are exactly the same. There is no change to your drill." He paused, letting the inherent contradiction hang in the air. If it was the same, why the secrecy? Why the special storage? Why the civilians? "The only thing you need to know," he continued, his gaze sweeping across their puzzled faces, "is that its performance will be different. You will see things you have not seen before. When you do, you will not comment on it. You will not speculate. You will simply do your jobs." The briefing ended as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a vacuum of unanswered questions. The sailors filed out, their minds buzzing with a potent mixture of confusion and a strange, nascent excitement. They had been given a tool and told it was revolutionary, but denied any explanation of how or why. The secrecy wrapped around the VT shells was a tangible presence, a 6th passenger aboard the ship, silent and watchful. It created a new kind of tension, one layered over the ever-present fear of enemy attack. It was the tension of the unknown, the suspense of waiting for a curtain to rise on a play whose script they had not been allowed to read. As the Helena weighed anchor and steamed out of the lagoon, returning to the vast, empty battlefield of the ocean, her crew looked at the sky with a new, curious anticipation. They were carrying a mystery into the fight, a secret weapon whose first words would be written, not in a manual, but in fire and thunder. The horizon was a thin, sharp line of cobalt blue, a deceptively peaceful seam between sea and sky, until the first specks appeared. They grew with terrifying speed, resolving from dots into the distinct predatory shapes of Japanese Aichi dive bombers. their fixed landing gears giving them a grotesque skeletal look as they tipped into their attacks. Deck of the USS Helena, the world dissolved into its familiar, frantic rhythm of survival. The general quarters alarm was a shrill, metallic scream in the ears, followed by the thunderous concussion of the main batteries and the frenetic, chattering staccato of the smaller anti-aircraft guns. Gunners swiveled their weapons, their faces set in masks of concentration and fear, hurling steel and hope into the sky in a desperate bid to weave a protective wall of flak. For these veterans of the slot, it was the same grim calculus fire: enough shells, and statistics might grant a lucky hit. But this time, the mathematics of death had been rewritten. Deep in the ship's magazine, sailors, their bodies slick with sweat in the oppressive heat, handled the unmarked VT shells with the same brute efficiency as the old ones, their curiosity subsumed by the immediate physical demands of loading the hungry hoists. The shells traveled upward, were rammed into breaches, and were fired into the air with the same deafening roar. Then something impossible happened. High above the ship, in the empty air well short of the lead dive bomber, a flash of light bloomed. It was not the impact explosion against a plane's fuselage they were accustomed to, nor the useless puff of a timed fuse detonating in vacant sky. This was a silent, bright flower of orange and black that erupted precisely where the bomber was about to be, a perfectly timed execution in the clouds. A split second later, the sound reached the deck, a sharp, clean crump that was distinct from all other explosions. The Aichi flew directly into the expanding cloud of shrapnel. Its wings sheared off in a glittering spray of metal and fuel, and the aircraft crumpled, transforming from a weapon into a tumbling, burning coffin. All along the Helena's deck, the frantic activity faltered. Gunners froze, their hands still on the triggers, their mouths agape. They stared, uncomprehending, as a second shell detonated mid-air, and a third, and each one a silent, brilliant judgment that found its mark without the need for a direct hit. The sky, usually a canvas of near misses and futile traces, was now filled with these terrifyingly accurate bursts. The Japanese formation, flying with the disciplined arrogance of past successes, disintegrated into chaos. Planes swerved violently to avoid the lethal blossoms that seemed to anticipate their every move. The relentless, diving attacks lost their cohesion, becoming a scattered, desperate affair. The sailors witnessed a zero, caught in the simultaneous blast of two proximity fused shells, simply come apart in the air, its pieces scattering across the waves below. The stunned silence on deck broke into a wave of raw, incredulous euphoria. Men who had spent months watching their best efforts fall harmlessly behind enemy aircraft now saw those same aircraft being swatted from the sky with an efficiency that bordered on magic. They were not just shooting, they were hitting. The mysterious VT shells were not just different, they were transformative. The boost to morale was instantaneous and profound, a physical force that straightened backs and hardened jaws. The fear was not gone, but it was now alloyed with a fierce, newfound confidence. They were no longer the hunted, praying for a lucky break. They were the hunters, armed with an invisible claw that could reach out and tear the enemy from the sky. As the last of the Japanese planes retreated, leaving behind only the smoke trails of their fallen comrades, the crew of the Helena looked at each other, their eyes sharing a single unspoken thought. The secret they carried was not just a new weapon, it was a deliverance. The statistical graphs plotting aircraft losses in the Pacific began to tell a new story, their once placid lines twisting into a steep, satisfying dive. What had been a war of attrition, a brutal exchange of ships and planes measured in grim percentages, was transforming into a one-sided slaughter in the skies. The secret whispered as VT was no longer a mystery to the crews who used it. It was a gospel of survival, a tangible force that had tilted the very physics of naval combat in their favor. The transformative impact of the Proximity Fuze rippled out from each successful engagement, measured not just in downed enemy aircraft, but in the lives that continued unabated below decks, in the families that would remain unbroken, and in the profound confusion sown the ranks of their enemies. On the USS Helena, the change was personal. Seaman Robert Kincaid, a loader on a 5-inch gun mount, had developed a permanent tremor in his hands during the early battles of 42, a physical relic of the helplessness he felt watching Japanese fowls dive unmolested through a storm of ineffective flak. He had seen friends vanish in fireballs, their screams swallowed by the roar of explosions. But after the first combat use of the VT shells, the tremor had begun to fade. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut during every air raid alarm. But it was now overshadowed by a fierce, focused purpose. He handled the unmarked shells with a reverence once reserved for holy relics, feeling their cool, deadly weight, and knowing that inside that steel casing was not just explosive, but intelligence, a guardian angel with a radius of destruction. He no longer prayed for luck, he trusted in the ghost in the machine. The fuse had given him back a sense of agency, transforming him from a participant in a lottery of death into a wielder of a precise and terrible instrument. Below, in the sickbay that had so often run red, pharmacist's Matt Second Class Leo Esposito found his world strangely quiet. The frantic, bloody triage of past engagements was replaced by a manageable trickle of minor shrapnel wounds and heat exhaustion cases. The stainless steel tables remained gleaming, the surgical kits unused. He remembered the specific coppery smell of the wardroom-turned-operating theater, the frantic shouts of the surgeons, the piles of blood-soaked gauze. Now the air smelled only of antiseptic and the faint, greasy odor of machinery. He spent his time inventorying supplies, instead of holding down a thrashing man during an amputation. The Proximity Fuze, a weapon he would never see, had become his most effective medical tool, preventing the wounds before they could be inflicted. It had saved lives he never had to try to patch back together, granting him the profound peace of an empty sick bay in a war zone. This salvation for the Allies was bewilderment and terror for the Japanese. Pilots who had once pressed their attacks with near impunity, trusting in their speed and the Allies' poor marksmanship, now found the sky itself turning against them. They reported a new, inexplicable phenomenon to their intelligence officers. American flak was becoming preternaturally accurate. Shells were no longer exploding in random patterns, but detonating with uncanny precision directly in their flight paths. A formation would be torn apart by blasts that seemed to anticipate their maneuvers, erupting in the empty air they were about to occupy. The confidence born from countless successful missions curdled into a superstitious dread. They began to speak of magic shells and spooky fuses, their tactical briefings faltering in the face of this technological leap they could not comprehend. Their aggressive close-in tactics, once their greatest strength, became a suicide pact. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical losses. They were no longer fighting men, but a ghost in the wire, an invisible marksman who never missed. The tide of the air war, which had for so long flowed in their favor, had not just been stemmed. It had been irrevocably turned, and they were drowning in its new mysterious current. The buzz was a sound that drilled into the soul, a rasping mechanical snarl that severed the nerves of every Londoner who heard it. It was the sound of the V1, the Doodlebug, a pilotless engine of terror that flew until its fuel ran out. then fell in a silent, indiscriminate death plunge. The battle for Britain's skies, once fought against human pilots in Messerschmitts, had descended into a new, more psychologically grueling war against an automated, mindless menace. The anti-aircraft batteries ringing London, their crews weary from years of conflict, now faced a target that offered no satisfaction of a duel, no chance to outwit a human foe. They were shooting at a machine, a flying bomb whose only purpose was to fall and destroy. Their timed fuses and barrage fire were a desperate, costly guesswork against an object small, fast, and flying a straight, predictable line. A simplicity that made it all the more maddening to kill. The order to adapt the naval Proximity Fuze for ground use against the V1 threat arrived as both a relief and a new, immense pressure. The scientists, who had perfected the fuse for the violent high-G environment of a naval cannon, now had to recalibrate it for the different, yet equally demanding physics of a land-based anti-aircraft gun. The problem was one of trajectory and timing. A shell fired from a ship at a diving plane had a steep, closing arc. A shell fired from the ground at a low-flying level V1 had a much flatter trajectory, and the Doppler effect on the returning radio signal was different, a subtle shift in frequency that the fuse's brain had to be taught to interpret correctly. The adaptation was a frantic round-the-clock effort in hidden British labs, a race against the clock measured in the daily tally of civilian casualties from the buzz bombs. The fuse, once destined for the Pacific, were rerouted, their internal components carefully adjusted, their sensitivity tuned to the unique signature of the V1's pulse jet engine and sheet metal frame. The first batteries to receive the modified fuses were positioned in the green fields of Kent, the last line of defense before London. The crews, a mix of seasoned veterans and young conscripts, were briefed with the same cryptic ambiguity as the sailors of the Pacific. They were told they were receiving a new type of ammunition, that its performance would be unprecedented, and that under no circumstances were they to discuss what they saw. The shells were stored under guard, their unmarked crates, a source of intense curiosity and skepticism. The men had been fighting the V1s for weeks, watching the sinister, flame-tailed aircraft drone implacably through their barrages, their own explosions lagging behind or blooming uselessly ahead of the target. Hope was a scarce commodity, worn thin by constant failure and the relentless demoralizing buzz from the sky. Then, one crisp afternoon, the radar screens painted a contact. The familiar, hateful drone grew from a hum to a roar. The gun crew sprang into action, their movements a well-practiced ballet of loading and aiming. The command to fire was given. The first shell raced away, a blur against the summer blue. The gunners tracked it, their bodies tensed for the familiar sight of a near miss. But the explosion, when it came, was not a near miss. It was a direct, mid-air obliteration. The shell did not chase the V1. It simply intersected its path, and at the perfect, preordained moment, decided to die. A flash of light consumed the nose of the flying bomb, and the entire device disintegrated in a spectacular, satisfying fireball, its sinister buzz cut off as abruptly as a switched-off radio. The debris rained down harmlessly over empty fields. A stunned silence fell over the battery, broken only by the crackle of the falling wreckage. Then, a slow, spreading wave of marvel transformed the men's faces. The gun captain lowered his binoculars, his mouth agape. He had spent the war trying to hit things, and for the first time he felt like he truly had. The next V1 that appeared met the same fate. And the next. The sky, once a corridor for these unstoppable harbingers of doom, became a killing field. The crews watched, awestruck, as their shells began to consistently, almost magically, find their marks. The relentless psychological torment of the buzz bomb threat was being answered not with more noise and fury, but with a silent, surgical precision. They were no longer just firing shells. They were deploying an invisible, intelligent net that snatched the terror from the sky before it could reach the city. The marvel on the faces of the anti-aircraft crews was a mirror of the relief spreading through London. A new, thinking guardian now watched over them, its judgment delivered in fire and thunder, its presence a silent promise that the tide of automated terror would, at last, be turned. The battlefield success of the Proximity Fuze was a victory that had to be buried deeper than any state secret. Every mid-air detonation over the Pacific, every V1 obliterated before it could reach London, was not just a tactical win, but a potential intelligence leak. The very effectiveness of the weapon was its greatest vulnerability. Each use risked revealing its existence to observant enemy. The war thus bifurcated for the scientists and high command. One war was fought with flak and fire, the other with ink and obfuscation, a shadow conflict waged in briefing rooms and propaganda offices to keep the Fuze's true nature a ghost in the machine. A deliberate campaign of misinformation was set into motion, a web of lies woven with the threads of half-truths and plausible deniability. Controlled leaks to the press, carefully vetted by military censors, attributed the sudden, devastating accuracy of Allied anti-aircraft fire to revolutionary new gun-laying radar and vastly improved training for gunners. The official narrative celebrated the sharp-eyed American sailor and the steadfast British gunner, their skills honed to a supernatural sharpness. It was a story the public could understand and celebrate, a tale of human grit overcoming technological odds. Behind the scenes, internal reports were sanitized. Combat after action reviews spoke generically of improved ammunition performance and enhanced fusing systems. The word proximity was scrubbed from all but the most highly classified documents, replaced by the intentionally bland VT. The goal was to make the miracle seem mundane, to hide the revolution in plain sight by attributing it to evolutionary criminal Jinbu. This wall of secrecy was nearly breached, not by a spy, but by the brutal randomness of combat. During a fierce naval engagement in the Philippine Sea, a Japanese bomber, crippled by a proximity-fused shell but not destroyed, managed to crash land on a small, isolated, Allied-held atoll. The wreckage was mostly consumed by fire. But intelligence teams, conducting a routine sweep, made a chilling discovery. Amidst the twisted, scorched metal of the fuselage, they found a stud 5-inch shell, its nose cone cracked open from the impact. Inside, visible through the fracture, was not the simple mechanical clockwork of a standard fuse, but the unmistakable, intricate web of miniature electronics, a tiny, complex city of wires, tubes, and components. The report flashed up the chain of command with the speed of a lightning strike, carrying with it the potential to undo years of work. If Japanese technicians recovered that shell, if they could reverse engineer its principles, the entire Allied advantage would evaporate overnight. The order came back, swift and absolute. The wreckage and the shell were to be eliminated utterly and completely. A special team was dispatched by seaplane, arriving on the deserted beach under the cover of darkness. They did not have the tools for a delicate extraction. Their orders permitted no half measures. They packed the entire section of the fuselage, containing the shell with high explosives. The subsequent blast tore the wreckage apart, melting the delicate circuitry into an unrecognizable slag of glass and metal. For good measure, they incinerated the rest of the debris with flamethrowers, leaving nothing but a blackened scar on the coral and the sigh of the ocean waves. It was a close call, a moment where the secret had been exposed to the light, and the response had been as brutal and final as the weapon itself. The incident served as a grim reminder that their creation was so valuable. It was worth more than the intelligence gleaned from any single enemy aircraft. The secrecy was not just a policy. It was a fortress, and its walls had to be maintained with fire, if necessary. The final, convulsive battles of the war were a forge of fire and steel, and the Proximity Fuze was the hidden ally that tempered the Allied blade to a razor's edge. In the vast, churning waters of the Pacific, where the kamikaze threat reached its fanatical zenith, the Fuze performed their grim, automated ballet. Shells from American task forces rose to meet the sacrificial dives, detonating not where the planes were, but where they would be, filling the sky with a lethal intelligent shrapnel that shredded wings and snuffed out engines before the deadly plunges could be completed. The sea around Okinawa and Iwo Jima became a graveyard for Japanese aircraft, their pilots bewildered by the curtain of fire that seemed to possess a malevolent foresight. In Europe, as the Third Reich crumbled, the last V-1s and the first, terrifying jet aircraft were swatted from the skies over Antwerp and the Rhine by anti-aircraft batteries, whose shells now saw with an unerring eye. The Fuze's contribution was not in a single decisive stroke, but in the relentless, cumulative erosion of enemy air power, a silent, multiplying factor that saved countless ships, cities, and lives in the war's bloody twilight. For the scientists who had birthed the technology, the news of victory arrived as a complex, bittersweet tide-in. Laboratories across America and Britain, the bulletins declaring VE and VJ Day, were met not with rowdy celebration, but with a profound, weary silence. Men like Merle Tuve and Emil Voss looked at the banks of now idle test equipment and the final production reports, their minds echoing with the ghost of 1,000 technical arguments and late-night breakthroughs. There was relief, a deep, bone-level unclenching of tension that had been their constant companion for years. The weight of the world, which they had helped carry, was finally being set down. But intertwined with the relief was a poignant sadness, a mourning for the brilliant, destructive child they had created and were now suddenly orphaned from. Their creation had been a necessity, born of a specific, terrible moment, and that moment was passing. The purpose that had consumed their every waking hour, that had justified every personal sacrifice and ethical compromise, was now fulfilled. They had helped win the war, and in doing so, they had rendered their life's work, for a time, obsolete. On the decks of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, and in the ruined streets of Berlin, soldiers and sailors who had wielded the secret weapon experienced a similar duality of emotion. Gunners who had watched the magic shells transform them from hopeful marksmen into agents of certain death felt a fierce, proprietary pride. They knew, without fully understanding how, that the unassuming gray cylinders they had loaded had kept them alive, had turned certain death into a reprieve. They shared quiet, knowing glances, bound by a secret they still could not speak aloud. But this pride was tempered by the hollowed-out exhaustion that follows a long and brutal storm. They looked at the smoldering peace and saw the cost. The sky was finally, blessedly silent, but that silence was a memorial to all who had fallen, friend and foe alike, to the very efficiency they had unleashed. The Fuze had been a shield, but it had also been a terrifyingly effective sword, and the end of its use brought not just victory, but the somber responsibility of surviving it. The war was over, and the mixed legacy of the weapon that helped end it, a legacy of salvation and destruction, of brilliant innovation and profound loss settled over the victors like a dust that would take years to clear. For years, the secret had been a ghost, a silent partner in the machinery of victory, known only to a select few and felt by many as an inexplicable shift in fortune. It had flown in the shells that saved ships and swatted buzz bombs from the sky, a technological spectre whose presence was inferred only by its miraculous effects. But with the peace came the long-awaited unshackling of truth. The war was over, the need for absolute secrecy had passed, and the ghost was finally to be given a name, a face, and a story. The revelation of the Proximity Fuze to the public was not a single event, but a rolling tide of disclosure, a carefully orchestrated unveiling that transformed a weapon of war into a symbol of Allied ingenuity. The first official announcement came from the Pentagon, delivered in a press conference room, packed with reporters and buzzing with anticipation. A senior general, standing before a bank of microphones, did not merely describe a new piece of artillery. He unfolded a narrative of scientific triumph, speaking of a tiny self-contained radio set that could fit inside a shell and grant it the power to sense its target. He used simple, powerful analogies: a bat's echolocation, a man feeling his way in the dark to demystify the complex physics for the public. As he spoke, large diagrams were unveiled, showing the intricate interior of the fuse, its miniature tubes and compact circuits laid bare for the world to see. The room, initially filled with the frantic scratching of pencils on notepads, fell into a stunned hush, then erupted in a wave of astonished murmurs. The magic that had confounded the enemy and saved countless lives was not magic at all, but the product of years of clandestine, brilliant work. The abstract terror of the kamikaze in the V1 was suddenly reframed, answered not by luck or sheer courage, but by quiet, relentless intellect. This official narrative was swiftly given blood and bone by the veterans who had been its beneficiaries. Newspapers and radio programs were suddenly filled with the accounts of sailors and soldiers, men who had been bound by secrecy, but were now free to speak of their awe. A gunnery officer from the USS Helena, his voice steady over the crackle of a long-distance radio line, described the first time he saw a shell detonate not on impact, but in the empty air, and the Japanese dive bomber fly directly into the blast. It was like watching a miracle, he said, the wonder still fresh in his tone years later. We went from praying for a hit to knowing we had one. It changed everything. A British anti-aircraft gunner, interviewed in a Priority. London pub, spoke of the day the buzz bombs stopped reaching the city. We went from feeling helpless to feeling like giants, he recalled, his mates nodding in grim agreement. We were told not to ask questions, just to load the special shells. Now we know why. We were loading a piece of a laboratory, a bit of genius, into our guns. The public reaction was a powerful cocktail of awe, pride, and a profound sense of retrospective relief. The hidden narrative of the war was being rewritten before their eyes. The staggering reduction in Allied casualties in the latter stages of the conflict, once attributed to superior tactics and fighting spirit, now had a concrete, technological explanation. Editorial cartoons depicted a giant brain inside her artillery shell. Newsreels showed animated diagrams of the fuse's principles, simplifying the complex science into a digestible, thrilling story of innovation. There was a collective sense of having been protected by an unseen shield, a secret weapon that had been their guardian angel. This awe quickly crystallized into a demand for recognition of the unsung heroes, the scientists and engineers who had toiled in anonymity. Their names, once classified, began to appear in print. Merle Touvet, Emile Voss, Alistair Finch, and hundreds of others were pulled from the shadows and thrust into the spotlight. They were no longer faceless government employees. They were the architects of a quiet revolution. The men whose late-night eureka moments and stubborn perseverance had bent the very laws of physics to the service of survival. The revelation was more than just a disclosure of a military secret. It was a long-overdue tribute, a nation turning to its quiet geniuses and finally saying, "We see you and we owe you." The war ended, but the ghost in the machine refused to die. It had been conceived in desperation, born in secrecy, and baptized in the fire of combat, yet its true life was only just beginning. The principle of the Proximity Fuze, the radical idea of a machine that could sense its environment and act upon that perception, did not demobilize with the soldiers. It was a seed that had been planted in the fertile ground of necessity. And in the peace that followed, it germinated, sending out tendrils that would slowly, irrevocably, reshape the modern world. The thinking shell was not merely a weapon. It was a key that had unlocked a new way of interacting with reality, and its legacy would extend far beyond the smoldering battlefields and silent guns. In the immediate aftermath, the military applications evolved with a terrifying elegance. The same principles that allowed a shell to detonate near an aircraft were adapted to create proximity sensors for anti-personnel mines, making battlefields more lethally intelligent. They were refined for guided missiles, becoming the electronic eyes that could lead a warhead unerringly to its target, a direct descendant of the flak that had swatted the V-1 from the sky. Radar, which had been the Fuze's distant, hulking cousin, was itself miniaturized and refined by the same relentless drive for smaller, sturdier electronics. The Cold War's intercontinental ballistic missiles and sophisticated air defense networks were all children of that original desperate need to make a 5-inch shell see. The battlefield of the future would be a place of thinking weapons, a realm where metal decided the moment of its own death, and it was a future the Fuze had authored. But the true revolution was a quiet one, migrating from the realm of destruction to the sphere of daily life. The engineers and physicists who had been forged in the secret laboratories dispersed into the burgeoning post-war industries, carrying with them the hard-won knowledge of miniaturization, rugged electronics, and solid-state physics. The fragile vacuum tubes that had been the Fuze's greatest challenge were soon supplanted by the transistor, a device whose development was accelerated by the gray, same wartime urgency. This, in turn, gave birth to the integrated circuit, the silicon heart of the modern computer. The journey from a room-sized calculating machine to a pocket-sized smartphone was paved with the lessons learned from squeezing a radio set into a shell casing. The Fuze's legacy was in the flight control systems of civilian airliners, in the radar that guided ships through fog, in the medical imaging devices that saw inside the human body without a single incision. It was in the garage door opener that sensed an obstruction and the supermarket door that slid aside at a person's approach, everyday miracles born from a weapon of war. The long-overdue recognition came in ceremonies under bright lights, a stark contrast to the shadowed labs where the work had been done. Medals were pinned on the lapels of men who were more comfortable with a soldering iron than a tuxedo. Merle Trouvé, Emile Voss, and their British counterparts stood awkwardly as politicians lauded their ingenuity, their quiet revolution now, a matter of public record and national pride. But the greatest award was not a piece of metal on a ribbon. It was the silent, pervasive presence of their creation in the fabric of civilization. They had set out to solve a single brutal problem: how to hit a fast-moving airplane. In doing so, they had ignited a chain reaction of innovation that touched everything from global defense to the thermostat in a suburban home. Their story became the ultimate testament to the theme of ingenuity, a demonstration that the most profound revolutions are often the quietest, beginning not with a shout, but with the faint, persistent echo of a radio wave bouncing back from a target, a signal that the world could be made to listen and to think. The weight of a secret is not measured in pounds or pages, but in the quiet moments it steals from a life. for Dr. Alan Breck, the brilliant MIT engineer who had traded the certainty of his laboratory for the shadows of Section T. The burden had become a second skin, a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the surface of his existence. His journey had begun not with a grand patriotic call, but with a quiet, compelling summons that had severed him from his old world as cleanly as a scalpel. He remembered the last morning in his own lab, the scent of rosin and warm vacuum tubes, the unfinished amplifier on his bench, a project left in mid-thought, forever frozen in time. He remembered the photograph of Helen and the boys, their faces bright with a life he was about to leave behind, a life where his work was a source of pride to be shared over the dinner table, not a void of silence. The initial spark, the idea of a thinking shell, had filled him with an electric, almost boyish excitement. It was the ultimate engineering puzzle, a challenge that danced on the edge of the possible. In those early days at the secret facility, surrounded by the best minds of a generation, the air had crackled with intellectual fervor. They were pioneers, charting an unknown technological frontier. He would lose himself for hours in the elegant dance of circuit diagrams, the complex mathematics of radio wave propagation, a beautiful, abstract language. In those moments, the war felt distant, a grim backdrop to a thrilling cerebral adventure. He was not building a weapon. He was solving an equation, and the solution was a thing of beauty. But the desert of failure had eroded that initial wonder. The relentless cycle of build, test, and shatter in the shake and bake rig was a grinding mill that pulverized optimism. He watched his intricate designs, products of weeks of painstaking labor, reduced to glittering dust at the bottom of a steel casing. The sacrifices felt hollow then. He'd lie awake in his Spartan quarters, the phantom sound of shattering glass in his ears, and think of the birthday party he had missed for his youngest son, the empty chair at the dinner table, the worried look in Helen's eyes that he could not soothe with the truth. The weight of the mission, once an honor, became a crushing pressure. Was he here, away from his family, to fail? Were they all just chasing a phantom, their brilliance no match for the brutal, unyielding laws of physics? The moments of doubt were a cold fog, seeping into the laboratory, making the soldering irons feel heavy in his hand, and the schematics look like maps to nowhere. The breakthrough, when it finally came with Voss's battery, had been less a triumph and more a reprieve. It did not erase the years of strain, the frayed relationships back home, the personal cost that was tallied in missed first days of school, and quiet anniversaries spent alone. When the deployment orders came, a different kind of chill settled over him. Holding a completed fuse, he no longer saw an elegant solution. He saw the intricate web of wires, the tiny, glowing heart of a vacuum tube, the culmination of his life's work. And he understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that this beautiful, brilliant object was now an instrument of death. He thought of the young men on the other side, faceless enemies in intelligence reports, who would be torn apart by the invisible decision his creation would make. The ethical vertigo was profound. He had humanized the technological achievement by pouring his own humanity into it, his time, his intellect, his family, and in doing so, he had made its purpose all the more terrible to contemplate. The journey from idea to deployment was not a straight line of progress. It was a spiral, winding through peaks of intellectual ecstasy and valleys of profound personal doubt, and it had changed him irrevocably. The man who had been summoned was not the man who now watched the crates being loaded for the front. The first had been a scientist. The second was something more, and something less. A creator forever haunted by the destructive life of his creation. The memory of the old way was a phantom limb, an ache of ingrained helplessness that still twitched in the muscles of leading seaman Arthur Pendleton every time the air raid alarm screamed through the HMS Typhoon. For years, the drill had been a liturgy of futile hope. The frantic scramble to the Oerlikon Mount, the heavy, oily smell of the gun, the desperate tracking of a silver speck against the vast, indifferent sky, and the prayer, always the prayer, that this time the thousands of pounds of steel they hurled heavenward would find their mark. He had seen the tracers curve behind diving Stukas, close enough to count the rivets, yet never close enough to kill. He had felt the deck shudder from near misses, the concussions, a mocking echo of their own impotence. War, in his experience, was a brutal lottery, and the house always won. The briefing for the new ammunition had been a masterpiece of maddening ambiguity. The officers, their faces set in grim, unreadable masks, had spoken of enhanced performance and special conditions, their words wrapping the new shells in a shroud of mystery that only amplified the crew's nervous curiosity. Pendleton, a practical man forged in the shipyards of Glasgow, had listened with a healthy dose of skepticism. He had seen too many war-winning secrets fizzle into the fog of battle. These new shells looked no different from the old ones. The same cold weight, the same machined steel, but they were handled with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics, stored under guard and spoken of in hushed tones. It felt like being asked to trust in magic on a vessel run by engineers and gunners. Then came the day. The phantom limb was severed. The Luftwaffe came in low and fast, a swarm of Focke-Wulf skimming the whitecaps. The familiar dread coiled in Pendleton's gut as he manned his station, his hands performing the well-worn ballet of loading and firing. The first shells from the forward batteries arced away, their trajectories no different from 1,000 others he had witnessed. But then, the sky itself seemed to rebel against the old order. High above the churning sea, well short of the lead German fighter, a silent, perfect flower of fire and shrapnel bloomed in the empty air. It was not an impact explosion. It was an apparition, a detonation that happened precisely where the aircraft was about to be. The Focke-Wulf flew directly into the heart of the blast, its wing shearing off in a grotesque, beautiful ballet of disintegrating metal. The familiar roar of the engines was replaced by the tearing sound of its death. A stunned silence, deeper than any he had known, gripped the gun deck. Pendleton froze, a fresh shell heavy in his hands, his mouth agape. He watched, uncomprehending, as a second shell performed the same impossible feat, and then a third. The German formation, once a disciplined spearhead, dissolved into a chaotic, scattering flock, their pilots desperately jinking to avoid the lethal blossoms that seemed to anticipate their every move. The sky was no longer a void where luck ruled. It had become a chessboard, and their shells were the pieces, moving with a terrifying, intelligent purpose. The awe that washed over him was a physical force, so potent it momentarily eclipsed his fear. He was not just firing a weapon. He was witnessing a fundamental